The dead don't rest easy in room 3, and I should have known that from the start. My name is Director Hayes, and I've been running Westfield Memorial Home for 23 years. In all that time, I've learned that funeral homes have their own rhythms, their own quiet protocols that keep everything moving smoothly, from intake to final services. We have 3 preparation rooms, a viewing chapel, offices upstairs, and a small apartment where I sometimes stay during busy periods. Room 3 has always been different, though I couldn't put my finger on why until last month. The building dates back to 1947, built by the Westfield family as both funeral home and residence. When I bought it in 2001, old Marcus Westfield told me the place had personality, which I took to mean character, history, the kind of gravitas that makes families feel their loved ones are in respectful hands. The hardwood floors creak in just the right places, the lighting casts warm shadows, and the prep rooms stay consistently cool without much help from the HVAC system. Room 3 sits at the end of the hall, past rooms 1 and 2, with a single frosted window facing the parking lot. We use it for our more complicated cases, trauma victims, decomposition issues, anyone requiring extensive restoration work. The room has better ventilation than the others, industrial-grade equipment, and more privacy. Families never see room 3. That's probably for the best. The first strange thing I noticed happened 3 weeks after Mrs. Chen's funeral. I was reviewing security footage from the previous night, checking timestamps for insurance purposes, when I saw the door to room 3 swing open at exactly 2:17 in the morning. It stayed open for 11 minutes, then closed with the same slow, deliberate motion. No wind, no mechanical failure, just a door opening and closing on its own schedule. I figured it was a maintenance issue, old hinges, building, settling, maybe vibrations from the highway. But when I checked the door the next day, the hinges were solid, the frame was level, and the latch mechanism worked perfectly. I made a note to have it looked at and forgot about it, until the next week, when I reviewed the footage again. Same time, same duration. 2:17 a.m., 11 minutes, then closed. That's when I started paying attention to other details. In the morning, after the door had done its nocturnal routine, I'd find the deceased positioned slightly differently than how I'd left them. Nothing dramatic, a head turned a few degrees toward the door, an arm that had been straight now bent at the elbow, fingers that seemed to be reaching rather than resting. Small changes, the kind you might attribute to settling or your own faulty memory. But I've been preparing bodies for over 2 decades. I know how I position them, and I know how they stay put. The dead don't move unless something moves them. I started staying late, positioning myself in the hallway with a clear view of room 3. The first few nights, nothing happened except the door opening right on schedule. I'd watch it swing open, revealing the darkened room beyond, and then I'd wait. Sometimes I thought I saw movement inside, shadows shifting, a subtle change in the quality of darkness, but whenever I'd get closer, the room would be still. On the 4th night, I brought a flashlight and worked up the courage to approach the open doorway. The beam illuminated the prep table where Mr. Morrison lay, waiting for his morning service. He was a retired school teacher, died peacefully in his sleep. No trauma, no complications. But as my light swept across him, I could swear his head was turned toward me, eyes closed but face angled in my direction, like he was listening for something. I took a step into the room, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath came out in visible puffs. The flashlight beam started to waver, not from my shaking hands, but like the light itself was being bent or dispersed. And then I heard a sound like fabric rustling, like someone adjusting their position to get more comfortable. Mr. Morrison's mouth had fallen open slightly, and from deep in his throat came the faintest whisper of air, like a sigh of relief or recognition. His fingers, which I'd positioned flat against his sides, were now curled as if beckoning someone closer. I backed out of the room immediately. The door remained open for exactly 7 more minutes, then closed with that same measured precision. In the morning, Mr. Morrison looked exactly as I'd originally positioned him. No evidence of the night's disturbance except for a lingering chill in room 3 that took until noon to dissipate. This pattern continued for weeks. Every night at 2:17, the door would open. Every morning, I'd find subtle changes in the deceased, never obvious enough to alarm families, but consistent enough that I started documenting everything with photographs. The changes were always oriented toward the door, as if whatever was inside the room was watching something leave. I tried staying in room 3 overnight, sleeping in a chair beside the prep table, but on those nights, the door would remain closed. It only opened when I was outside, watching, like it needed privacy for whatever transaction was taking place. The breakthrough came when I installed a motion sensor camera inside the room, positioned to capture the prep table and the doorway simultaneously. The footage from that night showed the door opening, as always. But what happened next made me understand why room 3 felt different from the other. At 2:23 a.m., 6 minutes after the door opened, a figure appeared in the doorway. Not solid, not quite transparent, but present a woman in an outdated dress, her face obscured by shadow. She entered the room with purposeful steps and approached whoever was on the prep table. For 3 minutes, she stood beside them, one hand resting on their forehead in what looked like a blessing or farewell. Then she turned and walked back toward the door, pausing at the threshold to look back once before, disappearing into the hallway. The deceased always moved during those 3 minutes of contact, heads turning, hands reaching, mouths opening as if to speak. Not in distress, but in recognition, in peace. I've been running this footage over and over, trying to understand who she is and why she comes. The dress suggests someone from decades past, maybe from the Westfield era. Maybe someone who lived here when this was still a residence. Someone who made this place her home long before it became mine. I don't try to stop her anymore. Room 3 opens every night at 2:17. She makes her visits, and the door closes at 2:28. The families get their services, the deceased get their final farewells. And I've learned to accept that some protocols in this business go deeper than anything I was trained for. The dead don't rest easy in room 3. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe rest comes later, after the proper goodbyes have been said. I've been tending graves for 31 years, and I can tell you that headstones don't sink unless there's a reason. My name is Tom, and I work maintenance at Hillcrest Cemetery, have since 1993. It's honest work, mowing, trimming, resetting stones that frost heave or settling has knocked askew. Most days are routine. Check the sprinkler system, edge around the newer sections, maintain the older plots where families still visit regularly. The cemetery covers 47 acres, with sections dating back to 1856. I know every grave, every family plot, every memorial bench. I know which stones need attention and which ones will stand firm for another century. Plot 47B has been giving me trouble for 2 months now. The plot belongs to Sarah Kellerman, age 7, buried this past September after a brief illness. Nothing traumatic, nothing that would explain what's been happening since. Her stone is modest granite, professionally installed with a proper concrete foundation. The inscription is simple: Sarah Rose Kellerman, beloved daughter, 2016 to 2023, forever in our hearts. Below that, a small etching of a butterfly. 3 weeks after the burial, I noticed the stone was sitting lower than it should be, maybe an inch. Nothing dramatic. But when you've been doing this work as long as I have, you notice when things aren't level. I figured it was normal. Settling happens sometimes with new graves, especially after heavy rain. We'd had a wet October, and the soil was still compacting around the casket. I brought my tools out and reset the stone, making sure the foundation was solid and level. Took most of the morning, but it looked right when I finished. The butterfly etching caught the afternoon light just like it should, and everything seemed back to normal. 2 weeks later, it had sunk again. This time, nearly 3 inches. That's when I started paying closer attention to plot 47B. I'd walk by every morning during my rounds, checking the stone's position, looking for signs of settling or shifting in the surrounding soil. The grass was healthy, the plot borders were clean, and there was no evidence of water damage or foundation problems. But every few days, that stone would be a little lower. The strange part wasn't just the sinking, it was how precisely it was happening. The stone wasn't tilting or shifting sideways like you'd expect from unstable ground. It was descending straight down, as if something underneath was pulling it deeper into the earth. The surrounding soil showed no disturbance, no signs of erosion or collapse, just a headstone slowly disappearing into the ground like quicksand. I reset it 4 more times over the next month. Each time, I'd dig deeper, reinforce the foundation, make sure everything was properly stabilized. And each time, within days, I'd find it lower than before. By December, the stone was sitting almost 8 inches below ground level, the butterfly etching barely visible above the grass line. That's when I started noticing Mr. Kellerman's visits. David Kellerman had been coming regularly since the funeral, which isn't unusual for a grieving parent. Most families visit frequently in the first few months, then gradually taper off as they find other ways to honor their loved ones. But Mr. Kellerman's visits were different. He came twice daily, morning and evening, and he always spent at least an hour kneeling beside the stone. At first, I thought he was just talking to his daughter, sharing his day, telling her he missed her. That's common and healthy. But as the stone continued sinking, his behavior changed. He started bringing a small gardening trowel, digging around the edges of the headstone, trying to clear away the soil that seemed to be swallowing it. His hands would be muddy when he left, his knees stained with dirt and grass. One evening in late December, I was finishing my rounds when I heard him talking to the stone. Not the usual one-sided conversation of grief, but something more desperate. He was kneeling in the frozen ground, his pants soaked through, leaning close to where the butterfly etching had almost disappeared. "Come back up, baby girl," he was saying, his voice raw from cold and emotion. "Come back up where Daddy can see you." He was digging with his bare hands now, trying to expose more of the stone, but as fast as he cleared the soil away, it seemed to fill back in. His knees were bleeding through his pants from kneeling on the frozen ground, but he didn't seem to notice. He just kept digging and pleading, like he believed Sarah was somehow down there, trapped beneath the earth, waiting for him to uncover her. I didn't interrupt. There are some kinds of grief you don't interfere with unless someone's in immediate danger. But I started watching his visits more carefully after that, making sure he wasn't harming himself in his efforts to reach his daughter's stone. The sinking accelerated in January. What had been a gradual descent became more dramatic, inches disappearing overnight. I'd reset the stone in the morning, and by evening, it would be noticeably lower. The soil around the plot remained undisturbed, but something underneath was definitely pulling that stone down into the earth. Mr. Kellerman's twice-daily visits became longer and more intense. He'd arrive with bottled water to soften the frozen ground, small tools to help with his digging, and thick knee pads to protect himself during his prolonged kneeling vigils. Sometimes I'd find him there before sunrise, sometimes well after dark, always in the same position, always whispering the same words. "Come back up, baby girl. Come back up where Daddy can see you." Last week, I decided to try something different. Instead of resetting the stone, I let it sink. I wanted to see how far it would go, whether there was some natural limit to whatever was happening. By Friday, only the very top edge was visible above ground level. Mr. Kellerman could barely make out the butterfly etching, and his digging became more frantic, more desperate. On Saturday morning, I found him collapsed beside the plot, hypothermic and exhausted. His hands were torn from digging in the frozen ground. His knees had bled through multiple layers of clothing, and he was mumbling incoherently about Sarah calling to him from underground. The paramedics said he'd been there for hours, maybe all night, trying to follow his daughter's headstone down into the earth. While he was in the hospital recovering, I took my excavator and dug down around plot 47B, trying to understand what was causing the stone to sink. What I found made me wish I'd left it alone. The concrete foundation was intact, but beneath it, the soil was loose and dark, like it had been recently disturbed. Deeper down, maybe 4 feet below where the foundation should have stopped, I found a void, a hollow space in the earth about the size of a child's body. The walls were smooth, compressed, as if something had been moving through that space, creating a tunnel that led down into darkness I couldn't measure. I filled in the void with concrete and reset Sarah's stone one final time, building the foundation deeper and stronger than any headstone should ever need. It's been stable for a week now, sitting at proper ground level where it belongs. But Mr. Kellerman still comes twice daily, still kneels beside his daughter's grave, still whispers for her to come back up. And sometimes, when the wind is quiet and the cemetery is empty, I swear I can hear something answering him from deep underground. A small voice, muffled by earth and concrete, calling back to her father from whatever hollow space she's found beneath our careful, measured world of headstones and graves. Wood doesn't knock back, but I wish someone had told me that before I started working in this business. I'm Ruth, and I've been an embalmer at Morrison Sons Funeral Home for 18 years. It's detailed work, chemistry, anatomy, artistry, all rolled into one. Most people don't understand what we do down here in the prep rooms, and that's probably for the best. They see the final result at the viewing, the peaceful repose we create for families to say goodbye. They don't see the hours of careful work that goes into making death look like sleep. The process is methodical. First, we position the body and begin arterial injection, replacing blood with embalming fluid through the carotid artery. Then we handle cavity treatment, aspirating organs and injecting preservative chemicals. Finally, we set features, apply cosmetics, and dress the deceased for viewing. Every step has its protocols, its timing, its quiet rhythms. I've prepared over 1,000 bodies in my career, from accident victims to centenarians who died peacefully in their sleep. Each case is different, but the routine remains the same. Set up my instruments, check fluid levels, start the arterial pump, and work steadily until the preservation is complete. It takes about 3 hours for an average case, longer if there are complications. 3 months ago, during Mrs. Patterson's preparation, I heard the first knock. It came exactly 43 minutes into the arterial injection, just as the fluid was beginning to circulate properly through her system. 3 soft taps from inside her casket, which was positioned beside my work table for efficiency. Not random sounds, deliberate knocks, evenly spaced, like someone asking for attention. I paused the pump and listened. Nothing. Mrs. Patterson had been a retired librarian, died of heart failure at 84. No complications. Her casket was a mid-range model with a solid oak construction, properly sealed and cushioned. New wood sometimes makes settling noises as it adjusts to temperature and humidity, especially in our climate-controlled prep rooms. I resumed the injection and forgot about it until the next case. Mr. Davidson, 76, former electrician, died in his sleep after a long illness. 43 minutes into his preparation, I heard it again. 3 knocks from inside his casket. The same rhythm, the same soft insistence. This time, I stopped what I was doing and approached the casket. I tapped once on the lid with my knuckle, a gentle test. 3 knocks came back immediately, perfectly timed, like an echo or a response. That's when I knew wood wasn't making those sounds. Over the next month, it happened with every case. Always during arterial injection. Always at the 43-minute mark. Always 3 knocks. Young or old, male or female, didn't matter. The knocking was consistent, and it always responded when I knocked back. I started documenting it, timing each occurrence, noting any variations in rhythm or intensity. The knocks were never aggressive or disturbing, more like a gentle greeting, someone announcing their presence, but they were definitely coming from inside sealed caskets. And sealed caskets don't have room for anything that could make deliberate, responsive sounds. I mentioned it to Mr. Morrison, our director, but he suggested it was settling wood or mechanical vibrations from the arterial pump. Reasonable explanations, the kind that make sense in daylight. But when you're alone in the prep room at midnight, with a body on the table and something knocking back at you from inside a closed casket, reasonable explanations feel thin. I started varying my routine, testing whether the timing was connected to the embalming process itself. If I paused the arterial injection at 30 minutes, the knocking would wait. If I adjusted the flow rate or changed fluid types, it still came at 43 minutes of actual injection time. Whatever was causing it was tied specifically to that stage of the process, when the preservative chemicals had fully replaced the blood and the body had achieved its final state of preservation. The breakthrough came during Mr. Chen's preparation in November. He'd been a musician, played piano at the community center, died suddenly of a stroke at 59. His family wanted an open casket service, so I was taking extra care with his positioning and features. As I worked, I found myself talking to him, something I do sometimes when cases feel personal. I told him about his family's plans for the service, how his wife had requested his favorite suit, how they wanted his hands positioned as if he were resting between songs. When the 43-minute mark approached, I warned him about the knocking, almost joking that he might hear from some previous visitors. The 3 knocks came right on schedule, but this time they were different, softer, more musical, like fingers tapping on piano keys rather than knuckles on wood. Without thinking, I knocked back with a simple rhythm. 3 quick taps followed by 2 slow ones. The response was immediate and complex, a full sequence of knocks that sounded like Morse code, or music, or conversation in a language I didn't recognize. It went on for nearly 5 minutes, a back-and-forth dialogue between me and whatever was inside Mr. Chen's casket. When it stopped, the silence in the prep room felt profound, like the end of a performance. I finished his preparation in that silence, but something had changed. The next morning, when his family came for the viewing, his wife stopped short at the casket and started crying, not from grief, but from recognition. She said he looked exactly like he did when he played piano, peaceful and focused, like he was listening to music only he could hear. That's when I understood what was happening during those 43 minutes of arterial injection. That's the moment when preservation is complete, when the chemistry of death is stabilized, when the body reaches its final state before viewing. And that's when they say goodbye to each other, the newly preserved to those who came before them. A quiet network of communication between the dead that we never see. The knocking isn't random or meaningless. It's introduction, recognition, welcome. The deceased acknowledging each other across the thin barriers of wood and time, sharing whatever knowledge they've gained about the space between life and whatever comes next. I don't interrupt anymore. When the 43-minute mark approaches, I pause my work and let them have their conversation. Sometimes it's brief, just the 3 traditional knocks and a simple response. Sometimes it goes on for minutes, complex exchanges that sound almost like music or poetry. Each person finds their own way to communicate, their own rhythm of introduction to the community they're joining. Last week, during Mrs. Rodriguez's preparation, the knocking came as usual. But this time, when I tapped back, I heard something that made me step away from the table. Mixed in with the response from her casket, I heard echoes, faint knocking from other caskets I'd prepared over the past months, stored throughout the funeral home, all joining in what sounded like a chorus of welcome. Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't just talking to 1 or 2 recent cases. She was being introduced to everyone, a whole gathering of voices welcoming her into whatever fellowship the dead maintain in the quiet hours before their services. I finished her preparation in silence, but as I cleaned my instruments and prepared to leave, I heard one final sound, a single soft knock from her casket, directed at me. Not a greeting or goodbye, but acknowledgement. Thank you for listening. Thank you for understanding that some conversations are too important to interrupt, even when they're happening between people who should no longer be able to speak. Wood doesn't knock back, but the dead have found ways to make themselves heard anyway. And now that I know how to listen, I wouldn't dream of working any other way. There's always one empty chair that stays warm, and after 16 years of ushering funerals, I've learned not to ask why. I'm Frank, and I work at St. Matthew's Chapel, handling seating arrangements, programs, and general assistance during services. It's quiet work most of the time, greeting families, directing visitors to the guest book, making sure everyone finds their seats before the service begins. I know the chapel's rhythms, its acoustics, the way afternoon light filters through the stained glass windows. I know which pews creak, which kneelers stick, and which sections stay warmest during winter services. But I've never understood the chair in the back row, third seat from the aisle, that maintains body temperature even when no one's sitting in it. The chapel seats 150 people in traditional wooden pews, with padded cushions for comfort during longer services. The heating system is old but reliable, installed in 1968 and upgraded twice since then. Temperature stays consistent throughout the space, maybe a degree or two warmer near the radiators, cooler by the windows, but nothing dramatic enough to explain what I've been noticing. The warm chair phenomenon started 3 years ago during Mrs. Henderson's memorial service in February. It was a bitter cold day, single digits outside, and the chapel was struggling to maintain comfortable temperature despite running the heat all morning. Most of the seating felt cool to the touch, the way church furniture does in winter, but that one chair in the back row was different, warm as if someone had been sitting there for hours. I noticed it when I was doing my final check before the family arrived. I test seating regularly, making sure cushions are properly positioned and pews are stable. When I pressed my hand against that particular chair, it felt like touching a heated car seat, not burning, not uncomfortable, just persistently, noticeably warm. I figured it was positioned over a heating duct or near a radiator, but when I checked later, the closest heat source was 12 feet away. The chairs on either side were cool, the floor underneath was normal temperature, and there was no mechanical reason for that specific spot to retain heat. Over the following months, I started paying attention during services. That chair would be warm before anyone arrived, stay warm throughout the entire service, and remain warm for hours afterward. It happened regardless of season, weather, or attendance. Summer or winter, crowded service or intimate gathering. That chair maintained body temperature, like someone was permanently occupying it. The strange part wasn't just the heat, it was the behavior of mourners around it. Families would naturally avoid that chair, even when seating was limited. They'd squeeze together in adjacent seats, stand along the walls, or ask to bring in folding chairs rather than sit there. When I'd suggest it during crowded services, people would glance at it and decline without explanation, like they instinctively knew it wasn't available. I started observing more carefully during services, watching for patterns or signs that might explain what was happening. That's when I noticed the condensation. During emotional moments when families were crying, when the eulogy touched on particularly moving memories, when the grief in the room was most intense, moisture would form on the armrests of that chair. Not from humidity or temperature changes, but handprint-shaped condensation, as if invisible fingers were gripping the chair arms in response to the emotion around them. The handprints were small, delicate, definitely feminine. They'd appear during the most poignant parts of each service and fade slowly as the emotion subsided. Sometimes, I'd see them forming in real time, moisture beading in the exact shape of fingers and palms, then disappearing as mysteriously as they'd appeared. Last month, during the Patterson funeral, I witnessed something that made me understand this wasn't just a mechanical anomaly or trick of temperature. Mrs. Patterson was 92, a longtime member of our congregation, and her service drew a large crowd. Every seat was filled except for that warm chair in the back row. About halfway through the eulogy, when her son was sharing memories of his mother's dedication to community service, Mrs. Patterson's daughter started crying. Deep, anguished sobs that echoed through the chapel. As her grief intensified, I watched condensation form those familiar handprints on the warm chair's armrests. But this time, Mrs. Patterson's daughter responded to something I couldn't see. She kept turning around, looking directly at that empty chair, her expression shifting from grief to confusion to something like recognition. During a pause in the eulogy, she whispered to her brother, asking if he heard someone calling their mother's name. I was standing at the back of the chapel, close enough to hear her question, but far enough back to observe the entire scene. I didn't hear anyone calling Mrs. Patterson's name, but I watched her daughter's eyes track something moving from the warm chair toward the front of the chapel, as if she was following an invisible presence walking down the aisle. After the service, as families filed out and offered condolences, Mrs. Patterson's daughter approached me. She looked shaken, uncertain, like someone who'd experienced something they couldn't quite process. "Frank," she said, "this might sound strange, but did you notice anyone sitting in the back row, third seat from the aisle?" I told her the chair had been empty throughout the service. "That's impossible," she replied. "I kept hearing my mother's name being called from that direction, and I could swear someone was sitting there. A woman in a blue dress, older, maybe in her 70s. She seemed to know Mama, kept nodding during the stories about her volunteer work. I assured her that section had been empty, that I'd been monitoring it throughout the service. But her description troubled me, not because it was unusual for grieving people to see things that weren't there, but because it was so specific, so detailed, so confident. That evening, after everyone had left and I was closing the chapel, I sat in that warm chair myself. I wanted to understand what made it different, what might explain the persistent temperature and the condensation handprints. The chair was comfortable, well positioned to view the entire chapel, with good acoustics for hearing services. But as I sat there in the growing darkness, I began to understand why mourners avoided it instinctively. It didn't feel empty, even when I was the only person in the building. It felt occupied in a way that had nothing to do with temperature or moisture or mechanical explanations. Like sitting next to someone on a bus, aware of their presence even without looking directly at them. I've started researching the chapel's history, looking for records of regular attendees from previous decades, women who might have been dedicated enough to this space to maintain some connection to it after death. What I found was Mary Catherine Wells, a congregation member from 1956 to 1998, who attended nearly every funeral held in this chapel for over 4 decades. Mary Catherine was known for her compassion toward grieving families. She'd sit in the back row, third seat from the aisle, and offer comfort to anyone who seemed overwhelmed by their loss. After services, she'd approach mourners who looked particularly lost and share gentle words of understanding. The pastor's notes describe her as a ministry of presence, someone who made grief feel less isolating simply by bearing witness to it. Mary Catherine died in 1999, and her funeral was held in this chapel, in front of the same warm chair, where she'd comforted hundreds of other mourners. The chair has been maintaining body temperature ever since. I don't try to explain it anymore, and I don't encourage families to use that seat. Some spaces are meant to be occupied by those who've earned the right to permanent attendance. Mary Catherine spent 42 years offering comfort to the grieving, and apparently, death wasn't enough to end that ministry. The chair stays warm because compassion generates its own heat, and true service to others doesn't stop just because the heart stops beating. Mrs. Patterson's daughter saw Mary Catherine because grief makes us receptive to comfort, and comfort finds a way to make itself visible when it's needed most. There's always one empty chair that stays warm, and now I understand it's not empty at all. The deceased started humming 3 weeks ago, and now I can't drive in silence anymore. I'm Luis, and I work transport for Riverside Memorial Services, picking up bodies from hospitals, homes, and accident scenes, then delivering them to funeral homes throughout the county. It's solitary work, just me, the van, and whatever cargo I'm carrying from point A to point B. Most of the time, it's peaceful. I listen to music, enjoy the quiet roads, and treat each pickup with the dignity and respect the deceased deserve. My route covers 4 hospitals, 6 nursing homes, and 3 county facilities, usually running 12 to 15 calls per week, depending on volume. The van is specially equipped with a secured compartment in back, climate-controlled and properly ventilated. I've been doing this job for 11 years, and in all that time, I've never had any trouble with my passengers. Until Mr. Henley. I picked him up from County General on a Thursday night in January. Natural death, 93 years old. Family had already made arrangements with Morrison, Sons. Simple transport. Nothing unusual about the paperwork or circumstances. Mr. Henley had been a music teacher at the high school for 37 years before retiring, and according to his chart, he'd passed peacefully in his sleep. The drive from County General to Morrison's takes about 20 minutes on back roads, mostly quiet stretches, through farmland and residential areas. I had the radio on low, playing gospel music from the local station, something I do out of respect, figuring it's appropriate background for the journey. Nothing dramatic, just soft hymns and spiritual songs to fill the silence. About 10 minutes into the drive, I heard humming from the back of the van. It was quiet, almost inaudible under the radio, but definitely there. A low, melodic humming that seemed to match whatever song was playing. At first, I thought it was mechanical, maybe the refrigeration unit cycling on, or vibrations from the road creating harmonic resonance in the van's metal panels. But when I turned the radio volume down to check, the humming continued, staying in perfect tune with the music. I pulled over and checked the rear compartment. Mr. Henley was properly secured, showing no signs of disturbance. The temperature was stable. The ventilation system was working normally, and there was no obvious source for the sound I'd heard. I figured it was my imagination, stress from a long week, maybe audio memory playing tricks on me. But when I got back on the road and turned the radio up, the humming resumed. Not random or mechanical, but musical, harmonizing with whatever hymn was playing. When the song changed, the humming adjusted to match the new melody. When commercials came on, it stopped completely, resuming only when the music returned. I delivered Mr. Henley without incident, but the experience stayed with me. Over the next few days, I found myself listening more carefully during transports, wondering if other passengers might be making similar sound. Most of the time, the rides were completely quiet. No humming or harmonizing or unusual noises. But then I picked up Mrs. Crawford. She'd been a church organist for 52 years, died of complications from pneumonia at age 88. The pickup was routine, but during the drive to her funeral home, the same thing happened. Gospel music on the radio, soft humming from the back of the van, perfect harmony that matched every note and rhythm. This time, I was expecting it, listening for it, and there was no question about what I was hearing. Mrs. Crawford was humming along with the radio. Over the following weeks, it happened with increasing frequency. Not every passenger, but enough to establish a pattern. Always during musical radio programming, never during talk shows or commercials. Always melodic and appropriate to whatever was playing. Always from people who'd had some connection to music during their lives. Teachers, choir members, musicians, or just folks who'd loved singing. I started experimenting, changing stations during drives to see how the humming would respond. Classical music, country, soft rock, traditional hymns, whatever I played. If there was melody and harmony, my passengers would join in. Not all of them, but enough that I began to anticipate which pickups might include musical accompaniment. The humming was never disturbing or unsettling. If anything, it was peaceful, like having a quiet companion who appreciated good music. But it was definitely happening, and it was definitely coming from people who should no longer be capable of making any sounds at all. The situation escalated last month during Mrs. Rodriguez's transport. She'd been a professional singer in her younger days, performed with local bands and church groups throughout her career. When I picked her up from the hospital, I decided to test something. Instead of playing radio, I put on a CD of traditional Mexican folk songs, music that might have meant something to her. The humming that followed was extraordinary. Not just harmony, but full vocal accompaniment. Spanish lyrics sung softly but clearly from the back of the van. Wordless melodies that complemented every song. It was beautiful, haunting, and so unmistakably human that I had to pull over and sit in the driver's seat for 10 minutes, trying to process what I was hearing. Mrs. Rodriguez was singing. Not humming, not making random sounds, but actively performing music she recognized and loved. Her voice was clear and melodic, carrying emotion and technique that spoke to decades of practice and performance. When one song ended and another began, she'd adjust her style to match faster tempo for dance numbers, slower and more contemplative for ballads. During a particularly moving song about lost love and memory, I heard her voice break slightly, as if the lyrics were touching something deep and personal, even in death. That's when I understood that whatever was happening in the back of my van wasn't mechanical or coincidental. These people were conscious enough to recognize music, to respond emotionally to it, and to participate in it with intention and feeling. I started carrying different types of music on my routes: classical, jazz, gospel, folk, rock, country, trying to match musical preferences to the lives and backgrounds of my passengers. Most of the time, I guessed correctly. Church organists responded to hymns, former band members harmonized with jazz standards, and retired music teachers seemed to appreciate everything I played. But it was becoming difficult to concentrate on driving. The harmonizing was often so beautiful, so moving, that I'd find myself pulled into the music, forgetting that I was supposed to be focused on the road. My hands would tremble on the steering wheel when multiple voices joined together, creating accidental choirs in the back of my van. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago, during a multiple pickup day. I had 4 passengers, all from the same nursing home. All passed within hours of each other during a difficult night. Mr. Peterson had been a barbershop quartet singer. Mrs. Kim had taught piano lessons. Dr. Martinez had played guitar in a mariachi band. And Mrs. Thompson had directed the church choir for 25 years. I put on a CD of traditional hymns, thinking it would be appropriate for the group. What happened next was beyond anything I'd experienced before. All 4 voices joined in immediately, creating a perfect 4-part harmony that filled the van with sounds so beautiful it brought tears to my eyes. They sang together like they'd been practicing for years, each voice finding its proper place in the arrangement, supporting and complementing the others. Bass, tenor, alto, soprano, a complete choir, performing with professional skill and emotional depth. But it wasn't just the technical excellence that affected me. It was the joy in their voices, the obvious pleasure they were taking in making music together. These people had found each other in death, discovered that whatever consciousness remained could still appreciate beauty, still create art, still share the fundamental human experience of harmony and rhythm. I made it about 5 miles before I had to pull over. My vision was blurred with tears. My hands were shaking too badly to steer safely, and the emotional impact of their performance was overwhelming. I sat in a gas station parking lot for half an hour, listening to them sing hymn after hymn, each song more beautiful than the last. When I finally delivered them to their respective funeral homes, the singing stopped as soon as I opened the rear compartment. But I could swear I heard whispered goodbyes, soft words of gratitude, acknowledgement that I'd given them something precious during their final journey. I don't play music during transports anymore. Not because the singing disturbs me, but because it affects me too deeply to drive safely. The beauty of it, the unexpected gift of discovering that music transcends death, the privilege of witnessing these accidental performances, it's too much to handle while trying to navigate traffic and maintain professional composure. Now I drive in silence, but the quiet feels heavy and incomplete. I miss the humming, the harmonizing, the evidence that something essential and human persists beyond the end of life. I miss knowing that my passengers are still capable of joy, still able to respond to beauty, still connected to the experiences that made them who they were. Sometimes, during particularly long drives, I'll hear echoes of their voices in the silence, ghost harmonies that seem to come from memory rather than reality, phantom music that reminds me of all the songs we shared during those strange musical journeys. I've started carrying headphones, listening to recordings I made during a few of those special transports, but it's not the same as experiencing it live. The deceased don't hum anymore, at least not for me. Maybe they've moved on to whatever stage comes after the brief musical interludes they shared with a lonely transport driver. Maybe silence is what they need now. Peace instead of performance. But I know what I heard, and I know what it meant. Death doesn't end everything. Love of music, appreciation for beauty, the desire to share harmony with others, those things continue, finding expression in whatever form consciousness takes when the body stops working. The night shift is quieter now, but it's filled with the memory of voices that shouldn't have been able to sing, creating music that shouldn't have been possible, reminding me that the human spirit finds ways to make itself heard, even in the space between heartbeats. The flowers always tell me which side of the casket death is standing on. I'm Director Walsh, and I've been managing Oakwood Funeral Home for 26 years. In that time, I've overseen thousands of viewings, learned to read the subtle signs that distinguish a peaceful goodbye from a troubled one. Room C is our largest viewing space, with vaulted ceilings, soft lighting, and enough seating for extended families. It's where we hold our most formal services, the ones that require extra attention to detail and atmosphere. 3 months ago, I started noticing a pattern in the floral arrangements that troubled me more than any mechanical failure or staffing issue ever could. Every casket we place in viewing room C follows the same routine. Flowers arrive throughout the day before the service, arrangements from family, friends, colleagues, sometimes dozens of tributes surrounding the casket in careful displays. Our staff positions them according to size and relationship to the deceased, creating balanced, respectful presentations that frame the viewing area without overwhelming it. The flowers look perfect when families arrive for private viewings. Fresh, vibrant, properly hydrated, and positioned. But by the second day, something changes. Always the same thing. Always on the left side of every casket. The flowers begin to wilt in a precise line, as if someone has drawn an invisible boundary through the middle of each arrangement. Mrs. Henderson was the first case where I really noticed it. She'd been a beloved school principal, and her viewing drew elaborate floral tributes from students, faculty, and community members. Beautiful arrangements, roses, lilies, carnations positioned carefully around her mahogany casket. When I checked the room the morning after her private family viewing, half of every arrangement had turned brown overnight. Not random wilting, not the gradual fading you'd expect from cut flowers. A perfect line of death running through each display, dividing fresh blooms from withered ones with mathematical precision. The flowers on the right side of the casket remained vibrant, while those on the left had aged weeks in a single night. I assumed it was environmental, maybe a heating vent creating uneven air circulation, or humidity issues affecting one side of the room. I had our maintenance team check every system, test airflow patterns, measure temperature and moisture levels throughout the space. Everything was normal, consistent, properly balanced. But the pattern continued with every viewing. Mr. Davidson's service the following week, then Mrs. Palmer's memorial, then young Jake Morrison's tragic funeral after the car accident. Different families, different flowers, different arrangements, but always the same result. By the second day of viewing, a brown line of wilted blooms divided every floral display exactly in half. The families started noticing it too, not complaining, exactly, but asking questions. Why did some flowers die faster than others? Was there something wrong with the room's environment? Should they request different arrangements or relocate to another viewing space? I began photographing the floral displays each morning, documenting the progression of wilting to see if I could identify the cause. What I discovered was more unsettling than mechanical failure or poor flower care. The line of wilting moved, not randomly, but in response to changes in the positioning of the deceased. When we adjusted Mrs. Patterson's casket a few inches to accommodate wheelchair access for her disabled grandson, the line of wilted flowers shifted correspondingly. When we rotated Mr. Kim's casket 30 degrees to improve sightlines for the eulogy, the floral death zone rotated with it, maintaining the same relative position to his body. Whatever was causing the flowers to wilt wasn't fixed to a location in the room. It was connected to the deceased themselves, following them like a shadow or presence that cast botanical death instead of darkness. I started paying closer attention to other details during viewings. Were there temperature variations around the caskets, unusual sounds, movements, anything that might explain the floral phenomenon? What I found was more disturbing than mysterious plant death. The deceased were turning their heads, not dramatically, not in ways that families would notice during emotional farewells, but subtle shifts in positioning, gradual movements that accumulated over the course of 2-day viewings. And they were always turning toward the left, toward the side where the flowers wilted, like they were looking at something standing beside their caskets. Mrs. Rodriguez's viewing confirmed my suspicions. She'd been positioned, facing slightly to the right when we first opened her casket, a natural angle that presented her face well to approaching visitors. But over the course of her viewing, her head gradually turned leftward. Not enough for her family to notice during brief visits, but clear to me as someone who checked the room multiple times daily. By the second afternoon, she was facing directly left, toward the wall, where the most dramatic floral wilting always occurred. Her expression seemed more attentive, less peaceful, like she was engaged in conversation with someone standing just outside the range of my vision. I started experimenting with camera placement, hoping to capture whatever was causing these changes. Motion-activated equipment positioned to monitor the casket area, time-lapse photography to document the head movements, infrared sensors to detect temperature variations that might correspond to the floral wilting. The cameras showed the head turning, confirming what I'd been observing manually. Slow, gradual rotation over hours or days, always toward the left side of the casket. But they never showed what was causing the movement, never captured any external force or presence that might explain the phenomenon. The infrared sensors, however, revealed something significant. Throughout each viewing, there was a cold spot on the left side of every casket. Not dramatically cold, just a consistent temperature drop of 8 to 10 degrees in a space roughly the size and shape of a standing human figure. The cold spot was present from the moment we positioned each casket and remained until after the body was removed for burial. Last week, during Mr. Thompson's viewing, I decided to test my theory more directly. Instead of relying on cameras and sensors, I spent the night in viewing room C myself, sitting quietly in the back row of chairs, watching his casket and the surrounding flowers. Around 2:30 in the morning, I saw what I'd been looking for. The air on the left side of the casket began to shimmer, like heat distortion, but cold, creating a vague outline of a human figure standing beside Mr. Thompson's body. Not solid, not clearly defined, but present enough to create the temperature differential my sensors had been detecting. As I watched, Mr. Thompson's head began its gradual turn toward this presence. His expression remained peaceful, but his face definitely oriented toward whatever was standing beside him. The figure, if that's what it was, remained stationary, like someone keeping vigil, waiting patiently beside each new arrival. The flowers responded immediately to the presence's proximity. Petals curled and darkened, stems bent and withered, the life draining out of arrangements in real time as the cold figure maintained its watch. Not malicious destruction, just the natural consequence of something dead standing too close to living plants. I sat in that room for 6 hours, watching this silent communion between the recently deceased and whatever representative had come to stand beside them. The presence never moved, never acknowledged my observation, just maintained its patient vigil beside Mr. Thompson's casket. When morning came and the figure faded with the growing daylight, I understood what had been happening in viewing room C. The dead don't journey alone to whatever comes next. Someone comes to stand with them during their final days above ground, a guide or companion who waits beside their caskets until burial separates them from the world of the living. The flowers wilt because death has its own gravity, its own influence on living things. The deceased turn their heads because they recognize their escort, acknowledging the presence that will accompany them on whatever journey follows the closing of the casket. I don't try to prevent it anymore. Don't search for mechanical explanations or environmental causes. When families ask about the wilted flowers, I tell them it's natural variation in plant health. Nothing to worry about. I order extra arrangements now, knowing that half of each display will sacrifice itself to mark the presence of whatever patient figure stands beside our guests during their final viewings. The flowers always tell me which side of the casket death is standing on, and now I know that's exactly as it should be. No one should have to wait alone for their final journey, not even in the space between heartbeats and earth. Some graves dig themselves, and after 15 years of cemetery work, I've learned to recognize the signs. I'm Sam, and I maintain the grounds at Hillside Memorial Park. Everything from landscaping to grave preparation to monument installation. It's honest work that keeps me outdoors, working with my hands, helping families honor their loved ones in peaceful surroundings. The cemetery covers 68 acres, with sections dating back to 1872. I know every plot, every pathway, every corner where the old graves meet the new development. But row 12 in the original section has been giving me problems that don't show up in any groundskeeping manual. Row 12 runs along the eastern edge of the historic section, where the oldest burials meet the expansion area we developed in the 1990s. Official records show 24 marked graves in that row, properly spaced at regulation intervals, each with documented burial dates, death certificates, and maintenance records. I've been tending those graves for over a decade, mowing around the headstones, trimming edges, ensuring proper drainage. Last spring, I started finding extra depressions in the ground between the marked plots. At first, I assumed they were settling areas where old graves had sunken due to casket deterioration or soil compaction. It happens sometimes with burials from the early 1900s, before modern preservation techniques and vault requirements. I'd fill them in with topsoil, reseed the grass, and mark them for monitoring in case additional settling occurred. But these depressions were different. They weren't random spots where old burials had collapsed. They appeared in perfect spacing between existing graves, exactly 6 feet apart, as if someone had measured the intervals and deliberately created additional burial sites where none should exist. When I checked the cemetery's master plot plan, row 12 showed no available spaces. Every authorized burial location was occupied and accounted for, with detailed records dating back to the original land survey. But my measurements confirmed what I was seeing. New grave-sized depressions appearing in gaps that should have been too narrow for burials. I brought it to the attention of Mr. Peterson, our cemetery director, who reviewed the records and confirmed that no unauthorized burials had taken place in row 12. No permits issued, no services held, no bodies interred in the locations where I was finding depressions. Just mysterious sunken areas that matched the size and depth of standard graves. Over the summer, the pattern became more obvious. Every few weeks, I'd find another depression, always in row 12, always positioned with mathematical precision between existing plots. I started mapping them, documenting their locations and dimensions, trying to understand why they were appearing and whether they posed any safety concerns for visitors. The depressions were roughly 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 12 to 18 inches deep, exactly what you'd expect from settling above a burial site. But they were appearing in spaces where the ground-penetrating radar showed solid, undisturbed earth. No voids, no anomalies, no evidence of previous excavation or disturbance. I began staying late during summer evenings, working on maintenance projects that gave me reasons to be near row 12 when the cemetery was closed to visitors. I wanted to catch whatever was creating these depressions, whether it was natural settling, water erosion, or something else entirely. On a hot July evening, while trimming around monuments in the adjacent section, I heard digging sounds coming from row 12. Not mechanical digging, no machinery, no power tools, just the rhythmic sound of a shovel biting into earth. Steady, methodical, like someone working with practiced efficiency in the growing darkness. I approached carefully, expecting to find unauthorized visitors or vandals disturbing the graves. What I found was an empty space where digging sounds continued without any visible source. The sounds were coming from a spot between the Morrison headstone and the Kelly Monument, exactly where I'd filled in a depression 2 weeks earlier. But there was no one there, no equipment, no explanation for the clear sounds of excavation work being performed by invisible workers. I stood 15 feet away, listening to the unmistakable rhythm of grave-digging shovel penetrating soil, load being lifted and tossed aside, the scrape of metal against stone or root. The sounds continued for nearly an hour, methodical and purposeful, creating what I knew would be another perfectly measured depression in the morning. I didn't approach closer. Something about the situation felt sacred, like I was witnessing a ritual or ceremony that didn't include the living. The digging had intention, respect, the careful precision of someone who understood the importance of their work. When the sound stopped, I waited another 30 minutes before investigating the area. Fresh earth had been disturbed in exactly the pattern I'd come to expect. A grave-shaped depression, properly oriented, precisely positioned between existing burials. But there was no excavated soil anywhere nearby. No evidence of where the displaced earth had gone. I started researching the history of Row 12, looking for records of burials that might not appear in the official cemetery documentation. What I found explained everything and made the situation more unsettling than I'd imagined. Row 12 was the original paupers section, where indigent and unidentified deceased were buried in unmarked graves during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Before social services and proper death investigation, people who died without family or resources were interred in simple pine boxes, often without headstones or permanent markers. The cemetery records from that era were incomplete, many destroyed in a fire in 1927. But newspaper archives and city documents suggested that Row 12 contained far more burials than the current plot plan indicated. Dozens of unnamed dead, buried in spaces that were later designated as unused when the cemetery was resurveyed and modernized. The depressions weren't random settling or mysterious excavations. They were grave sites reclaiming their proper recognition, marking locations where forgotten people had been laid to rest without acknowledgement or memorial. The invisible digging was these lost souls preparing their own grave markers, creating visible evidence of their presence in a section where they'd been buried without records or memory. I stopped filling in the depressions after that discovery. Instead, I began maintaining them like proper graves, keeping the grass trimmed, ensuring proper drainage, treating them with the same respect I gave to marked burial sites. If Row 12 wanted to remember its forgotten residents, I wasn't going to interfere with that process. The digging sounds continue on quiet evenings, always in Row 12, always creating new depressions in spaces that correspond to historical burial patterns from the cemetery's earliest days. I've learned to recognize the rhythm, respectful, unhurried, done with the care of someone who understands the importance of proper interment. Last month, I started leaving small flowers on the unmarked depressions, simple arrangements that acknowledge the presence of whoever rests beneath the disturbed earth. Not elaborate tributes, just recognition that these spaces mark human lives, even if we don't know their names or stories. The digging has become less frequent since I began honoring the unmarked graves. Maybe acknowledgement was all they wanted, someone living who recognized their presence, who treated their resting places with appropriate dignity. Maybe the sound of invisible shovels was just their way of saying, "We're here too. Don't forget us in your careful maintenance of the remembered dead." Some graves dig themselves because forgetting someone doesn't make them less real. Death doesn't erase people who lived without leaving records, and cemeteries hold more stories than their official documentation can account for. Row 12 is teaching me that every depression in the earth might mark a life that deserves recognition, even if that recognition comes a century late from a groundskeeper who's learned to listen for the sound of forgotten people claiming their rightful places in the landscape of memory. The cemetery holds more than we buried there, and I've made peace with maintaining spaces for the dead who marked their own graves when the living failed to mark them properly. Every guest book tells a story, but there's always one signature that doesn't belong to anyone we can find. I'm Rosa, and I work as a funeral assistant at Sacred Heart Memorial Home, handling everything from flower arrangements to guest book management to family coordination during services. It's detail work that requires attention to small things, making sure programs are correctly printed, seating arrangements accommodate family dynamics, and memorial displays properly honor the deceased. After 12 years in this business, I've learned that families remember the little touches that show care and respect. Guest books are part of my responsibility. Simple but important leather-bound volumes where visitors sign their names and offer brief messages of sympathy. I set them up before each service, position them near the entrance where people can pause to sign before approaching the family or viewing area. After services, I preserve them for families as keepsakes of who attended and what comfort was offered during difficult times. 6 months ago, I started noticing signatures that didn't match any of the attendees. The first time it happened was during Mrs. Chen's memorial service in March. Beautiful service, well attended by family and friends, from her long career as a nurse at the county hospital. I'd positioned the guest book on a small table near the chapel entrance, with an elegant pen and a small card, explaining that signatures and messages would be preserved for the family. When I collected the book after the service, I found 43 signatures from people I could identify: family members, colleagues, neighbors, all faces I'd seen during the service. But there was also a 44th signature that puzzled me. With deepest sympathy, E.M., written in faded blue ink with handwriting that looked older, more formal than the contemporary signatures around it. I asked Mrs. Chen's daughter about the signature, thinking maybe it was from an elderly relative I hadn't noticed, or someone who'd left early. She studied the handwriting carefully, but couldn't identify E.M. or recall anyone with those initials attending the service. We went through the entire guest list, comparing names and initials, but found no match. The signature bothered me because it was so deliberate, so formal, written with obvious care and respect. Not a random scrawl or mistaken entry, but a purposeful message of sympathy from someone who clearly wanted to honor Mrs. Chen's memory. But no one could identify who had written it. Over the following months, the pattern repeated with disturbing consistency. Every guest book contained one unidentifiable signature, with deepest sympathy, E. Same handwriting, same faded blue ink, same formal phrasing, always positioned among the other signatures as if written during the service, never isolated or obviously added later. Mr. Davidson's service, Mrs. Palmer's memorial, young Jake Morrison's tragic funeral. Every guest book included the mysterious signature. I started paying closer attention during services, trying to identify who might be writing E.M. in our guest books. But I never saw anyone I couldn't account for. Never noticed elderly visitors using vintage pens or unfamiliar faces slipping in and out undetected. The families always responded the same way. When I asked about the signature, they'd study the handwriting, search their memories for relatives or friends with those initials, sometimes even call other family members to ask about E.M. But no one ever recognized the signature or remembered anyone matching that description attending the service. What made it more puzzling was the consistency of the handwriting and ink. If different people were signing E.M. at each service, you'd expect variations in penmanship, different pens, maybe different phrasing, but every signature was identical: same flowing script, same careful formation of letters, same vintage blue ink that looked like it came from a fountain pen rather than modern ballpoint. I started researching the history of Sacred Heart Memorial Home, looking for employees, previous owners, or regular attendees who might have had the initials E.M. and some connection to our funeral services. What I found was Emma Mitchell, a grief counselor who worked with bereaved families from 1968 to 1996, helping them navigate the emotional challenges of loss and memorial planning. Emma had been beloved by families throughout the county, known for her gentle presence during difficult times and her ability to provide comfort when people felt overwhelmed by grief. She attended hundreds of funerals during her career, not as a mourner but as a professional supporter, someone who could offer practical help and emotional guidance when families needed it most. Emma died in 1997, and her own funeral was held at Sacred Heart Memorial Home. According to the records, she'd specifically requested that her memorial service include an open guest book where colleagues and families she'd helped could share their memories of how she'd supported them during their times of loss. The guest book from Emma's funeral contained over 200 signatures from grateful families, many writing detailed messages about how she'd helped them cope with the death of loved ones. Her signature appeared in that book too, apparently written before her death as part of her final preparations. With deepest sympathy, E.M. I realized I'd been seeing Emma's signature in every guest book for months, written in the same careful script she'd used throughout her career when signing sympathy cards and memorial correspondence. But Emma had been dead for 26 years, and there was no way she could be physically attending services and signing guest books. I decided to test my theory during Mr. Rodriguez's service last month. Instead of positioning the guest book near the entrance where anyone could sign it unobserved, I placed it directly beside my station where I could monitor every person who approached it. I watched carefully throughout the entire service, noting each signature as it was added. 38 people signed the book during the service. I observed every signature, matched each one to a face and name I could identify among the attendees. But when I reviewed the book after everyone had left, I found 39 signatures. The last entry, written in familiar faded blue ink, read, "With deepest sympathy, E.M." I had been watching the guest book continuously, and no one had approached it after the final family member signed. But Emma's signature was there anyway, positioned naturally among the other entries, as if written during the normal flow of the service. I started leaving the guest book open on my desk between services, checking it periodically to see if the mysterious signature ever appeared when no funeral was taking place. It never did. Emma only signed guest books during active memorial services, when grieving families needed the comfort she'd provided during her lifetime. Last week, during Mrs. Patterson's service, something extraordinary happened. Mrs. Patterson's elderly sister, Margaret, approached the guest book and paused while reading through the signatures. She called me over, pointing to Emma's signature with tears in her eyes. "I remember this handwriting," she said. "Emma Mitchell helped our family when we lost our parents in 1984. She signed sympathy cards just like this, always with the same careful script. But Emma's been gone for years. How is her signature in this book?" I explained that Emma's signature appeared in all our guest books, though I couldn't explain how or why. Margaret nodded, understanding immediately what I was still struggling to accept. "Emma never stopped helping families," she said. "Death wouldn't end that kind of dedication. She's still here, still offering sympathy to people who need comfort, still making sure grieving families know they're not alone in their loss." Every guest book tells a story, and Emma's story is that true compassion doesn't end when the heart stops beating. Some people are so dedicated to serving others that death becomes just another assignment, another opportunity to provide comfort when it's needed most. I don't question the mysterious signature anymore. When families ask about EM, I tell them it's from someone who cares about their loss, someone who wants them to know their grief is witnessed and their loved one is remembered. That's always been true. Whether Emma is signing from memory, habit, or whatever form of consciousness allows her to continue the work she loved most. The guest books are richer for her presence, marked by someone who understood that sympathy is a gift that should be offered whenever families gather to honor their dead. The chapel bell rings 13 times before every funeral, and I've been counting those extra chimes for 3 years now. I'm Paul, and I've been the sexton at St. Catherine's Chapel for 19 years, responsible for building maintenance, groundskeeping, and general upkeep of our historic sanctuary. The chapel dates back to 1891, built by German immigrants who wanted a place of worship that reflected their traditional architectural values. The bell tower rises 68 feet above the nave, housing a bronze bell cast in Milwaukee in 1893. The bell was damaged by lightning in 2009 and has been disconnected from its mechanical ringing system ever since. No electrical connections, no automated timers, no way for it to ring except by manual operation using the rope system in the tower, and I keep that locked for safety reasons. But every night before a funeral, at exactly midnight, that bell rings 13 times. I first noticed it during Mrs. Cooper's funeral preparations in September of 2021. Her son mentioned that the bell had woken him up the night before the service, ringing what he counted as 13 chimes at midnight. I assured him that wasn't possible. The bell system had been disabled for over a decade, and no one had access to ring it manually. But curiosity made me check the tower the next morning, looking for signs of unauthorized entry or mechanical malfunction that might explain what he'd heard. The access door was still locked, the rope system was secure, and there was no evidence anyone had been in the tower. The bell itself showed no signs of recent movement or disturbance. I figured it was a mistake, maybe sounds from another source that resembled bell chimes in the quiet midnight hour. Church bells have a distinctive tone that can be confused with other metallic sounds, especially when heard from a distance or through sleep. I made a note to monitor the situation, but didn't think much more about it until the next funeral, when 3 different people mentioned hearing the bell ring 13 times at midnight. Mr. Davidson's service drew family from several states, and they'd stayed in various hotels around town. But during the pre-service gathering, multiple relatives independently mentioned being awakened by church bell chimes the night before. All described the same thing. 13 clear, deliberate rings at exactly midnight, distinct enough to count, but strange enough to remember. I started paying attention to the timing, documenting which nights I heard reports of bell ringing and comparing them to our funeral schedule. The pattern was consistent every night before a scheduled funeral service. The bell would ring 13 times at midnight. Never on other nights, never at different times, never with a different number of chimes. I began staying overnight in the chapel on funeral eves, sleeping in my office to monitor the situation directly. I wanted to determine whether the bell was actually ringing or whether people were hearing phantom sounds, auditory illusions created by expectation or suggestion. The first night I stayed over was before Mrs. Palmer's memorial service. I was reading in my office around 11:45 when I heard the tower creak just once, like someone had stepped onto the wooden platform where the bell hangs. Then silence until exactly midnight, when the bronze bell rang out clear and strong across the chapel ground. 13 deliberate chimes, each one perfectly timed, resonating through the building with the full voice of that 19th century bronze. Not phantom sounds or auditory imagination, but the actual bell ringing with the same authority it had possessed during its 130 years of active service. I rushed to the tower immediately after the 13th chime, unlocking the access door and climbing the narrow stairs to investigate. The bell was still, showing no signs of recent movement. The rope system was undisturbed, the mechanical components exactly as I'd left them, but the bronze surface was warm to the touch, as if it had just finished vibrating from a full sequence of chimes. I installed motion sensors in the tower after that, hoping to detect any physical presence that might explain the midnight ringing. I also researched the bell's history, looking for mechanical explanations or historical precedents that might account for its autonomous behavior. What I found was more disturbing than mechanical failure or unauthorized access. The bell had been ringing 13 chimes before funerals for over a century, long before electrical systems or automated timers. Church records from the early 1900s mentioned the phenomenon as a local tradition, something the community had come to expect and appreciate. But 13 is not a traditional number for funeral bells. Most churches ring once for each year of the deceased's life, or follow standard patterns like 3 chimes for the Trinity, or 7 for spiritual completion. 13 has no liturgical significance, no traditional meaning in funeral customs or bell-ringing protocol. I interviewed longtime parishioners, asking if they remembered the bell-ringing patterns from decades past. Mrs. Henderson, now 93, recalled the 13 chimes from her childhood in the 1930s. Her grandmother had told her it was the bell's way of marking the transition between life and death. 12 chimes for the months of earthly life, plus 1 additional chime for whatever comes after. According to Mrs. Henderson, the bell had been ringing 13 times before funerals since the chapel was constructed. Not every night, only before funeral services. Always at midnight, always with the same deliberate timing. The lightning damage and subsequent disconnection of the mechanical system had never stopped the midnight chimes. The bell knows when someone needs calling home, Mrs. Henderson explained. It's been announcing departures since before any of us were born, and it'll keep ringing long after we're gone. Some things don't need electricity or human hands to fulfill their purpose. I stopped trying to find mechanical explanations after that conversation. Instead, I began appreciating the bell's midnight announcements as part of the chapel's character, a reminder that our building serves purposes deeper than weekly worship services. The bell rings for the dead, because that's what bells have always done. Mark important transitions, announce significant events, call communities together during times that require witness and attention. Last month, during a particularly busy week with 3 funerals scheduled, the bell rang 13 times on 3 consecutive nights. Each midnight announcement was clear and strong, echoing across the town as it had for over a century. I received no complaints from neighbors, no questions about late-night noise disturbances. People have learned to accept the 13 chimes as part of St. Catherine's tradition, a gentle reminder that someone in the community is being prepared for their final service. I've stopped staying overnight to monitor the ringing, stopped installing sensors or searching for explanations. The bell serves its purpose without requiring my understanding or permission. Every night before a funeral, at exactly midnight, it rings 13 times to announce that death has visited our community, and someone will need our prayers, our presence, our witness to their final transition. The mechanical system remains disconnected. The tower stays locked, and I have no way to manually operate the bell even if I wanted to. But it continues its midnight ministry, marking the boundary between the day of death and the day of burial, calling the community to remember that someone among us is making the journey from time into whatever lies beyond the 13th chime. I've learned to find comfort in those midnight announcements, evidence that our chapel maintains its sacred purpose even when we're not actively conducting services. The bell knows when its voice is needed, and it provides that service with the same dedication it has shown for over a century of faithful marking of life's most solemn transitions. My filing system has been reorganizing itself for 2 months, and yesterday I found my own death certificate. I'm Anne, and I work as records keeper for Restwood Memorial Gardens, maintaining burial documentation, death certificates, and administrative files for a cemetery that's been serving the county since 1947. It's methodical work that requires absolute accuracy. Families depend on our records for legal purposes, genealogical research, and memorial planning. Every document must be properly filed, cross-referenced, and accessible when needed. Our filing system covers 78 years of burials, organized chronologically with cross-references by family name, plot location, and burial date. I maintain both physical files and digital records, ensuring redundancy and preservation of irreplaceable historical documents. The physical files are stored in numbered archive boxes, each containing approximately 50 to 60 individual burial records. Archive Box 9 has been behaving strangely since October. I first noticed the problem during routine maintenance, updating recent burial records and ensuring all documentation was properly filed. Box 9 contains records from June through August of 2021 routine burials, complete documentation, No unusual cases or complications. But when I opened the box to file Mrs. Henderson's updated paperwork, I found the contents had been reorganized. Not damaged or disturbed, but systematically rearranged. Death certificates that should have been filed chronologically were now grouped alphabetically by last name. Burial permits had been separated from their corresponding death certificates and refiled by plot location. Property deeds were organized by family relationships rather than purchase dates. The reorganization was thorough and logical, following a different filing protocol than the one I'd used originally. Not random shuffling or vandalism, but careful rearrangement by someone who understood cemetery record keeping and had decided my system needed improvement. I assumed one of my colleagues had reorganized the box during a special project or research request, though no one recalled working with those particular files. I restored the documents to chronological order and made a note to ask about authorization before anyone modified the filing system again. 2 weeks later, Box 9 had reorganized itself again. This time, the files were arranged by cause of death, all cardiac events grouped together, cancer cases in another section, accidents in a third category. Again, the work was meticulous and logical, but it wasn't following our established filing protocols. I began checking Archive Box 9 daily, documenting its contents and arrangement to track any unauthorized changes. What I discovered was more unsettling than occasional filing reorganization. The box was consistently rearranging itself overnight, always following a different organizational principle, always completed with professional thoroughness. One morning, I'd find files organized by age at death, children's records together, elderly deaths in another section, middle-aged deaths grouped by decade. Another morning, the arrangement would be by family relationships, all spouses filed together, all parents, all children who died before their parents. Sometimes the organization followed patterns I couldn't immediately identify, groupings that made sense only after careful analysis. I installed a security camera focused on the filing area, hoping to identify who was accessing Box 9 and reorganizing its contents. The footage showed no human activity around the filing cabinets during overnight hours, but time-lapse review revealed something extraordinary. The box contents were moving on their own. Documents shifting position gradually over several hours, death certificates sliding between folders, burial permits reorganizing themselves by some invisible principle. Not dramatic movements, just slow, purposeful redistribution of files, as if guided by careful, methodical hands that cast no shadows and left no fingerprints. I researched the specific records contained in Box 9, looking for connections or patterns that might explain why those particular files were reorganizing themselves. What I found was troubling. Many of the deaths from that time period were people who died alone, without family present, often discovered days or weeks after death occurred. Isolated elderly residents, estranged family members, people who'd lived solitary lives and died without immediate survivors to handle their affairs. The kind of cases where the county handled burial arrangements, where minimal family involvement meant sparse documentation and bureaucratic rather than personal memorial processes. The reorganization patterns began making sense when I viewed them from that perspective. The files weren't just arranging themselves randomly, they were connecting people who'd shared similar experiences of isolation, grouping deaths that reflected common patterns of loneliness or abandonment. The invisible filing system was creating community among people who died without community, organizing solidarity among the forgotten dead. I started leaving Box 9 alone, allowing whatever presence was reorganizing it to continue their work without interference. The arrangements became more sophisticated over time, creating connections between cases that revealed shared experiences I wouldn't have noticed through chronological filing. People who died in the same apartment complex years apart, elderly residents from the same neighborhood who'd lived isolated lives, individuals who'd shared similar struggles with mental illness or addiction. The reorganization was creating a social network among the dead, acknowledging relationships and connections that had been invisible during their lifetime. It was beautiful and heartbreaking evidence that death doesn't end the human need for community, that even isolated people find ways to recognize kindred spirits among the other forgotten souls. But last Tuesday, I discovered something that made me question whether the filing reorganization was entirely benevolent. While researching burial records for a genealogy request, I opened Box 9 to find it organized in a new pattern I'd never seen before. Instead of grouping by cause of death or family relationships, the files were arranged chronologically, but not by death dates. They were organized by future dates, burial records sorted by dates that hadn't occurred yet. At the front of the box, I found a death certificate that made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped it. The document was filled out completely, signed by appropriate authorities, and bore an official county seal. But the name on the certificate was mine, Anne Patricia Connolly, date of death, listed as 3 days from the current date. My birth date was correct, my address was accurate, even my social security number was precisely recorded. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, time of death as 11:27 p.m., place of death as my home address. At the bottom of the certificate, in the section for funeral arrangements, someone had written, Restwood Memorial Gardens, Plot 17C. I knew Plot 17C. It was an available space in our newest section, one I'd walked past countless times during my daily rounds. According to the death certificate in my hands, that plot would be my final resting place in less than 72 hours. Beneath my death certificate, I found burial records for other people. I recognized colleagues from the cemetery office, neighbors from my apartment complex, the mail carrier who delivered to our building, all dated for deaths occurring within the next few months, all filled out with the same official precision as my own paperwork. The invisible filing system wasn't just organizing records of past deaths, it was preparing documentation for future deaths, creating burial records for people who were still alive, still working, still going about their daily routines, without knowing their files had already been processed and arranged. I removed my death certificate from Box 9, taking it home to study more carefully. The document looked authentic in every detail: proper watermarks, correct formatting, signatures that appeared genuine, but it was dated 3 days in the future, predicting my death with bureaucratic certainty. That night, I experienced chest pains for the first time in my life. Not severe, just unusual pressure and discomfort that made me conscious of my heartbeat, my breathing, the possibility that cardiac arrest might not be as distant as I'd always assumed. I spent the evening checking my pulse, monitoring symptoms, wondering if having a death certificate creates the death it documents. I called in sick the next day, avoiding Plot 17C and staying away from Restwood Memorial Gardens entirely. If the filing system could predict deaths, maybe physical distance from the cemetery would delay or prevent the cardiac arrest scheduled for 11:27 p.m. But on the morning my death certificate predicted I would die, I found myself driving to work despite my intention to stay home. Not consciously deciding to go, just following a routine so ingrained that my body carried me to the cemetery before my mind could object. I parked in my usual spot, walked to the office, and checked Archive Box 9 with the fatalistic curiosity of someone who'd already accepted their fate. My death certificate was gone, removed from the box sometime during the past 24 hours. In its place, I found Mrs. Rodriguez's burial record, dated for 2 days in the future, filled out with the same ominous precision that had characterized my own paperwork. I'm still alive, obviously, writing this account 3 weeks after my scheduled death date. The chest pains disappeared the moment I removed my death certificate from Box 9, and I've had no cardiac symptoms since. Whatever presence organizes our filing system can predict deaths, but apparently removing the documentation disrupts the process. I've been monitoring Box 9 daily, removing any death certificates dated for future deaths before they can manifest in reality. It's become an additional part of my job records keeper, an inadvertent guardian, filing paperwork for past deaths while preventing documentation of future ones. But I know I can't intercept every certificate, can't save everyone whose death has been predicted and filed. The invisible system works faster than I can monitor, creating burial records in other boxes, other filing systems, maybe other cemeteries throughout the county. Death keeps its own records, and those records have a way of becoming reality whether or not the living interfere with the filing process. My filing system has been reorganizing itself for months, creating community among the forgotten dead, and preparing documentation for deaths that haven't happened yet. I've learned that record keeping is more powerful than I understood, that documenting death gives it structure and authority that mere prediction lacks. Yesterday, I found 3 more future death certificates in Box 9, all for people I know, all dated within the next month. I removed them immediately, but I suspect others will appear tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until I retire or until my own death certificate reappears in a box I haven't learned to monitor yet. The dead organize their own records, and they've been keeping more accurate documentation than the living ever suspected. The refrigeration units only malfunction for people who died alone, and their families always comment on how peaceful they look. I'm James, and I've been working as a mortician at Valley View Funeral Home for 14 years, handling everything from body preparation to family consultations to facility maintenance. It's technical work that requires understanding of chemistry, anatomy, and refrigeration systems that preserve bodies between death and burial. Our facility has 6 individual refrigeration units, each maintaining precise temperature and humidity levels for optimal preservation. Unit 4 has been giving me problems that don't appear in any maintenance manual. The unit was installed in 2018, part of a facility upgrade that modernized our storage capabilities. State-of-the-art equipment with digital controls, backup systems, and monitoring alarms that alert us to any temperature fluctuations. All 6 units operate identically, maintaining 38 degrees Fahrenheit with minimal variation. But Unit 4 behaves differently when storing specific types of cases. The first incident happened last spring, during Mrs. Patterson's case. She'd been a reclusive widow, found in her apartment 3 days after death by a concerned neighbor. No family present at time of death. No visitors during her final weeks. No evidence she'd maintained close relationships with anyone in the community. A sad but not uncommon situation. Elderly people who outlive their social connections and die in isolation. When I placed Mrs. Patterson in Unit 4, the temperature began dropping immediately. Not a gradual cooling or minor fluctuation, but a dramatic plunge that triggered every alarm in the system. Within 2 hours, the internal temperature had fallen to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause frost formation on the viewing window and create preservation conditions far beyond anything we'd programmed. I assumed it was mechanical failure, a malfunctioning thermostat, sensor error, or compressor problem. I moved Mrs. Patterson to Unit 2 and called our service technician, expecting to find damaged components or electrical issues. But when the technician tested Unit 4, every system functioned perfectly. Temperature controls worked normally, sensors read accurately, and the unit maintained proper preservation conditions without any problem. I attributed it to a temporary glitch and returned to normal operations. But 3 weeks later, during Mr. Davidson's case, Unit 4 malfunctioned again. Mr. Davidson had also died alone, found in his trailer by the mailman. No family notified. County handling burial arrangements. Same pattern. Dramatic temperature drop, frost formation on viewing windows, preservation conditions that exceeded anything our equipment was designed to provide. Over the following months, I tracked the pattern carefully. Unit 4 only malfunctioned when storing people who died in isolation. No family present at death. Minimal social connections. Deaths discovered by neighbors, landlords, or public officials rather than loved ones. People who'd lived solitary lives and died without witness or immediate mourning. The malfunctions were always identical. Temperature dropping to 14 degrees within hours. Frost forming intricate patterns on the viewing windows. Preservation so effective that decomposition essentially stopped completely. Bodies stored in Unit 4 during these episodes remained in perfect condition for weeks, showing none of the gradual changes that occur even with proper refrigeration. But the strangest aspect wasn't the temperature anomalies, it was how the deceased looked after being stored in Unit 4 during a malfunction. Mrs. Chen had been brought to us after dying alone in a nursing home, where she'd lived for 3 years without receiving visitors. When I placed her in Unit 4, the temperature dropped immediately, and frost began forming on the viewing window in patterns that looked almost decorative, like winter scenery etched in ice. When I removed her for preparation 2 days later, she looked more peaceful than any body I'd ever worked with. Not just preserved, transformed. Her face had lost the tension and worry lines that marked her final years of loneliness. Her hands, which had been clenched when she arrived, now rested open and relaxed. Her expression suggested someone who'd found comfort or resolution, as if the extreme cold had given her something that warmth and life had denied her. The families always noticed it during viewings. Not the specific changes, they couldn't articulate what was different, but they consistently commented on how peaceful their loved ones appeared, how the isolation and sadness that had marked their final years seemed to have lifted. Even when families had been estranged or absent during the person's decline, they found comfort in seeing them looking so serene and settled. I started researching refrigeration effects on facial muscles and preservation chemistry, looking for scientific explanations for what I was observing. Extreme cold can affect muscle tension and skin elasticity, but not in ways that would create the specific changes I was documenting. The transformation was too consistent, too purposeful, to be explained by mechanical preservation processes. The breakthrough came when I decided to observe Unit 4 during one of its malfunctions. Mr. Rodriguez had died alone in his apartment, discovered by building maintenance after neighbors complained about unusual odors. Classic case for the pattern I'd been tracking. So I prepared to monitor Unit 4 throughout his storage period. I positioned myself in the prep room with a clear view of the refrigeration units, planning to document temperature changes and frost formation as they occurred. What I witnessed was more remarkable than mechanical malfunction or preservation anomaly. As the temperature dropped and frost began forming on the viewing window, the patterns weren't random ice crystal formation. They were deliberate, artistic, creating images that looked like winter landscapes, snow-covered trees, peaceful meadows, serene mountainsides. Not abstract shapes or coincidental resemblances, but detailed scenes that suggested comfort, beauty, and tranquil solitude. More significantly, the frost patterns were visible only from inside the unit, etched on the interior surface of the viewing window, where Mr. Rodriguez could see them. From my position outside, the window appeared normally frosted. But when I positioned myself to look through the window from his perspective, I could see the intricate winter scenes that surrounded him during his stay in the extreme cold. I realized Unit 4 wasn't malfunctioning. It was providing something that people who died alone had been denied during their lives. The extreme cold created an environment of perfect preservation and peace, while the frost patterns offered beautiful surroundings that replaced the loneliness and isolation they'd experienced in their final years. The unit was giving them what they'd never had: a beautiful, serene place to rest where temperature and time couldn't touch them, where artistic ice formations provided the aesthetic comfort they'd missed during lives marked by solitude and abandonment. I stopped trying to repair Unit 4's malfunctions after that understanding. When families brought us people who died alone, I made sure to use Unit 4 for storage, knowing that whatever process occurred inside would help transform isolation into peace, loneliness into serenity. Last month, during Mrs. Rodriguez's preparation, her daughter asked me why her mother looked so different from how she'd appeared during her final years of declining health and social withdrawal. I told her that sometimes death provides the rest and comfort that life denies, that preservation can restore peace that isolation had eroded. The daughter nodded, understanding intuitively what I'd learned through months of observation. "She looks like she did when I was young," she said, "before the loneliness changed her." before she stopped believing anyone cared about her anymore. The refrigeration units only malfunction for people who died alone, but those malfunctions provide something more valuable than standard preservation. They offer transformation, the chance for people who lived without beauty or comfort to spend their final days above ground, surrounded by winter artistry and perfect peace. Unit 4 continues its specialized service, creating Arctic sanctuaries for the isolated dead, giving them the serene solitude they chose in life, but with beauty and dignity they'd been denied. The families always comment on how peaceful they look, because peace is exactly what the extreme cold provides, not just preservation of the body, but restoration of the spirit that loneliness had damaged. The dead who died alone aren't alone anymore when Unit 4 claims them. They rest in winter palaces of frost and perfect cold, surrounded by ice art that transforms isolation into sanctuary, loneliness into chosen solitude, marked by beauty instead of abandonment. Our appointment book writes itself sometimes. And yesterday, a family arrived for their appointment 3 days before their loved one died. I'm Director Kim, and I've been managing Peaceful Rest Memorial Home for 17 years, handling everything from initial consultations to service coordination to facility scheduling. It's administrative work that requires careful attention to timing. Families need advance notice for services. Staff need time to prepare facilities, and our appointment system keeps everything running smoothly throughout busy periods. Our appointment book has been behaving strangely for the past 4 months, making entries that don't match any reservations or consultations I've scheduled. The book itself is a traditional leather-bound volume where I record all family meetings, service times, and facility reservations by hand. I prefer physical scheduling over digital systems because families appreciate the personal touch, and handwritten appointments feel more respectful than computer printouts during emotionally difficult conversations. The first unexplained entry appeared in September, penciled between 2 legitimate appointments in handwriting that wasn't mine. Morrison Family Consultation, 2 p.m. Thursday. Discuss arrangements for Robert Morrison. I didn't recognize the name, had no record of scheduling the appointment, and couldn't identify whose handwriting had made the entry. I assumed it was a scheduling error, maybe one of my staff had written the appointment while I was out, or a family member had added it during a previous visit. But when Thursday arrived, and the Morrison family appeared at exactly 2 p.m., I realized something unusual was happening. The Morrisons were expecting to meet with me about burial arrangements for Robert Morrison, who they said had passed away that morning. They had death certificates, burial permits, and detailed plans for services. But I had no prior contact with their family, no record of Robert Morrison's death, and no explanation for how their appointment had appeared in my book. More disturbing was the timing. The appointment had been written in my book 3 days before Robert Morrison died, scheduled for a consultation that couldn't logically have been arranged until after his death occurred. I handled their arrangements professionally, explaining that there must have been a communication error, but assuring them we could accommodate their needs. The services proceeded normally, and the Morrison family was satisfied with our care during their difficult time. But the experience troubled me enough to start monitoring my appointment book more carefully. Over the following weeks, additional unexplained entries appeared regularly. Chen Family Service Planning, Friday morning. Davis Burial Consultation, Monday afternoon. Rodriguez Memorial Arrangements, Wednesday evening. Always in the same unfamiliar handwriting. Always for families I'd never contacted. Always scheduled with precision and accuracy. When these families arrived for their mysterious appointments, they consistently had the same story. A loved one had died recently. They needed burial arrangements, and they were certain they'd scheduled an appointment with our funeral home. They'd bring paperwork, death certificates, and specific plans for services, convinced we'd been in contact before their arrival. But the appointments were always written in my book before the deaths occurred, sometimes days in advance, predicting family consultations that shouldn't have been possible to schedule. I started researching each name that appeared in unexplained appointments. checking obituaries and death records to confirm the timing of deaths versus appointment scheduling. The pattern was consistent. Appointments appeared in my book 3 to 5 days before the deaths they referenced, written by someone who knew which families would need our services before those families knew they'd need them. The handwriting bothered me most. It was old-fashioned, formal, written with a fountain pen rather than modern ballpoint. The script suggested someone from an earlier generation, someone who'd learned penmanship when careful handwriting was considered essential for professional correspondence. I researched previous owners of Peaceful Rest Memorial Home, looking for records of staff or directors who might have connection to the mysterious appointment entries. What I found was Margaret Powell, who owned and operated the funeral home from 1952 to 1988, known throughout the county for her compassionate service to grieving families. Margaret had been famous for anticipating family needs, often contacting bereaved relatives before they'd thought to arrange burial services. She had an uncanny ability to appear when families needed help most, offering support and guidance during the confusion that follows unexpected deaths. Her handwriting samples from old business records matched the mysterious entries appearing in my appointment book. Margaret died in 1991, and her funeral was held at Peaceful Rest Memorial Home. But apparently death hadn't ended her practice of scheduling appointments for families who needed burial services, even families who didn't yet know they'd need them. I decided to test my theory during one of the mysterious appointments. When the Chen family arrived for their consultation, I asked detailed questions about how they'd scheduled their meeting with us. Mrs. Chen explained that she'd received a phone call the day after her husband's death from someone representing our funeral home, offering to schedule a consultation to discuss burial arrangements. The caller had been an elderly woman with a kind voice, someone who seemed to understand exactly what services the Chen family would need and when they'd be ready to make arrangements. She'd suggested a specific appointment time, promised that our director would be available to help them, and assured Mrs. Chen that everything would be handled with appropriate care and dignity. I'd made no such call, had no record of contacting the Chen family, and employed no elderly female staff who matched Mrs. Chen's description of the person who'd scheduled their appointment. But the appointment had been kept perfectly, allowing me to provide exactly the services they needed at exactly the time they were ready to receive them. The mysterious scheduling continued throughout the fall, always benefiting families who seemed overwhelmed by the logistics of arranging burial services during grief. The unexplained appointments provided structure and guidance when families needed it most, ensuring they received professional help during their most vulnerable time. But last week, something happened that made me understand the true nature of what was occurring with my appointment book. I found an appointment scheduled for yesterday afternoon. Hendricks Family Emergency Consultation, 3 p.m. Friday. Discuss immediate arrangements for Margaret Hendricks. The name caught my attention because Margaret had been my grandmother's name, and Hendricks was my maiden name before marriage. At 3 p.m. Friday, my cousin David arrived for an appointment he was certain he'd scheduled, carrying death certificates and burial permits for our grandmother Margaret, who had passed away that morning. He explained that someone from our funeral home had called him immediately after grandmother's death, offering to schedule an emergency consultation to expedite burial arrangements. But my grandmother Margaret was still alive, living in assisted care and in reasonably good health. The death certificates David carried were dated for that morning, signed by appropriate authorities, listing cause of death as peaceful cardiac failure during sleep. According to the paperwork, she died at 6:27 a.m. and been discovered by nursing staff during routine morning checks. I called the assisted living facility immediately. Grandmother Margaret was fine, alert, eating breakfast, and asking about plans for her birthday party next week. She was alive and healthy, showing no signs of cardiac problems or impending health crises. But David insisted she died, had official documentation proving her death, and was convinced he'd scheduled an appointment to arrange her burial. The death certificate looked authentic, bore appropriate seals and signatures, and listed details that would be impossible to forge or fabricate. I realized that the appointment book wasn't just predicting deaths, it was creating them, establishing administrative reality that somehow manifested in official documentation and family memories. By scheduling appointments for burial consultations, the mysterious entries were establishing that deaths had occurred, even when the supposed deceased were still alive and healthy. I removed David's appointment from my book immediately, tearing out the page and destroying it completely. Within minutes, his death certificates faded like photographs exposed to sunlight, the text disappearing, until only blank paper remained. David looked confused, unsure why he'd come to a funeral home or what arrangements he'd thought he needed to make. I called the assisted living facility again. Grandmother Margaret was still alive, still healthy, with no record of any health emergency or death that morning. The mysterious appointment book had tried to create her death by scheduling her burial consultation, but destroying the appointment had prevented the administrative reality from manifesting completely. Our appointment book writes itself sometimes, creating meetings with families who need our services before they know they need them. But those appointments are more than scheduling conveniences. They're administrative spells that can create the deaths they claim to accommodate. I monitor my appointment book daily now, removing any entries I didn't write myself, destroying pages that schedule consultations for deaths that haven't occurred. It's become an additional part of my job, funeral director and inadvertent guardian, providing burial services while preventing premature burials. But I know I can't catch every mysterious appointment, can't prevent every death that gets scheduled without authorization. The appointment book serves purposes deeper than efficient scheduling, connecting families with burial services through administrative magic that transcends normal business procedures. Margaret Powell continues scheduling appointments from beyond death, ensuring that grieving families receive the care they need when they need it most. But sometimes, her helpful scheduling threatens to create the grief it aims to comfort, making appointments that transform living people into clients who require burial services. Every Tuesday at 4 p.m., someone walks down to our basement, and I've been tracking those footsteps for 6 months now. I'm Carl, and I work maintenance for Riverside Chapel, responsible for building upkeep, minor repairs, and general facility management. It's practical work that keeps me moving throughout the building, checking heating systems, replacing light bulbs, maintaining the old wooden floors that creak and settle with age and weather. I know every sound this building makes, every mechanical rhythm, every structural quirk that comes with 87 years of faithful service. But Tuesday afternoons bring footsteps that don't belong to anyone living. The basement runs the length of the chapel, housing mechanical systems, storage rooms, and archived records from decades of services. Stone foundation, concrete floors, minimal lighting, functional space that's not designed for regular occupancy. I go down there weekly for maintenance checks, but otherwise, the basement stays empty except for equipment and stored materials. The footsteps started in September, always on Tuesday afternoons at exactly 4 p.m. 12 deliberate steps down the wooden staircase, a pause of about 30 seconds, then 12 steps back up. The rhythm is consistent, measured, unhurried, like someone familiar with the stairs who knows exactly where they're going. I first noticed them while working on the heating system on a Tuesday afternoon. Clear, distinct footsteps from above, moving across the main floor toward the basement entrance, then descending the stairs with practiced confidence. I assumed it was Reverend Walsh or one of the volunteers, maybe coming down to retrieve something from storage. But when I went upstairs to see who it was, the chapel was empty. Doors locked, no cars in the parking lot, no evidence anyone had been in the building except me. I checked the basement thoroughly, looking for signs that someone had been down there, but found nothing disturbed or out of place. The following Tuesday, I heard the footsteps again. Same time, same pattern, 12 steps down, pause, 12 steps up. This time, I stopped my work immediately and listened carefully, trying to determine exactly where the sounds were coming from. The footsteps were definitely on our basement stairs, but when I climbed up to investigate, the chapel was again empty and locked. I started planning my Tuesday maintenance schedule to be in position to observe the basement entrance at 4 p.m. If someone was accessing our basement regularly, I needed to know who it was and why they were coming. Unauthorized access posed security risks, and regular visits suggested someone might be using the space inappropriately. The third Tuesday, I positioned myself in the main chapel with a clear view of the basement door. At exactly 4 p.m., I heard the footsteps beginning their descent, but the basement door never opened. The sounds were coming from behind the closed door, as if someone was walking downstairs that led nowhere, following a route that existed independently of our physical architecture. I opened the basement door immediately and descended the stairs myself, listening for additional sounds or evidence of presence. The basement was empty, but it smelled different, not musty or stale like usual, but like fresh earth, the kind of clean soil smell you get after rain or during spring gardening. Over the following weeks, I documented the pattern carefully. Every Tuesday at 4 p.m., 12 footsteps descended invisible stairs behind our locked basement door. The sounds were always identical in timing and rhythm, suggesting the same person making the same journey each week. But the basement remained empty, accessible only through the door that never opened during the mysterious footsteps. I researched the chapel's history, looking for information about previous basement use or regular visitors who might have established patterns that somehow persisted after death. What I found was troubling. Our basement had originally been a root cellar for the farmhouse that preceded the chapel, and later served as a temporary morgue during the influenza pandemic of 1918. During the pandemic, bodies were stored in the basement when the county morgue became overwhelmed, waiting for burial when cemetery workers were available. According to historical records, dozens of flu victims spent their final days above ground in our basement, lying on simple wooden tables while families waited for grave sites to be prepared. The basement stairs had been rebuilt several times over the decades, but they'd always led to the same destination, 12 steps down to a stone-walled space where the dead waited for burial. Someone who'd made that journey regularly during the pandemic might continue making it out of habit or duty, following a routine that death hadn't interrupted. I started staying in the basement during Tuesday afternoon footstep episodes, wanting to experience the phenomenon from the destination rather than observing from above. The first time I tried this, the experience was more unsettling than listening from upstairs. At 4 p.m., I heard footsteps descending toward me, but saw no one on the stairs. The sounds were clear and close, accompanied by the subtle creaking of wood under weight, but no visible person was making the journey. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs, directly in front of where I was standing. For 30 seconds, I felt a presence in the basement, with me not threatening, but purposeful, like someone conducting important business that required privacy and concentration. The smell of fresh earth intensified, and the temperature dropped several degrees, creating the kind of cool, humid environment that's ideal for preserving organic materials. Then the footsteps began ascending, climbing back up the invisible stairs with the same measured pace they'd used for the descent. When the sounds faded, the basement returned to normal temperature and its usual musty smell. I realized I was witnessing someone's weekly inspection of the basement, a routine established during the influenza pandemic when proper body storage was critical for public health and family dignity. Whoever had been responsible for checking on the deceased during that overwhelming time had continued their weekly rounds, ensuring that the basement remained suitable for its temporary morgue function. I started researching individuals who'd worked with flu victims during the pandemic, looking for records of morticians, undertakers, or medical personnel who might have established the Tuesday inspection routine. What I found was Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who'd volunteered her services during the crisis, checking on bodies stored in makeshift morgues throughout the county. Dr. Morrison had died in 1919, succumbing to the same influenza she'd been fighting. But her dedication to proper care of the deceased had apparently survived her own death. According to historical accounts, she'd made weekly rounds to every temporary morgue location, ensuring bodies were properly preserved and families were notified when burial arrangements could be finalized. Our basement had been one of her regular stops during the pandemic, and she'd apparently continued making those weekly inspections long after the crisis ended and the basement returned to storage use. I stopped trying to intercept or investigate the Tuesday footsteps after that discovery. Dr. NE202D. Morrison's weekly rounds were a service to the community, ensuring that our basement remained properly maintained and suitable for any future emergency that might require temporary body storage. Her inspections were professional, respectful, and beneficial to the chapel's ongoing function. Last Tuesday, I decided to acknowledge her presence directly. At 4 p.m., when the footsteps reached the bottom of the basement stairs, I spoke aloud. "Thank you for your service, Dr. Morrison. The basement is in good condition, and we appreciate your continued care." The 30-second pause extended to nearly a minute, as if she was surprised to be addressed after decades of solitary inspections. When the footsteps finally began their ascent, they seemed lighter, less burdened, like someone who'd been relieved of a duty they'd been carrying alone for too long. The footsteps still come every Tuesday at 4 p.m., but they've changed character. Less urgent, more peaceful, like routine maintenance rather than emergency inspection. Dr. Morrison continues her weekly rounds, but now she knows her service is recognized and appreciated by the living, who maintain the basement she helped establish as a place of dignity for the dead. Every Tuesday at 4 p.m., someone walks down to our basement to ensure it remains suitable for whatever service might be required. It's a comfort to know that dedication to proper care of the deceased transcends death itself, that some people continue their important work regardless of whether their hearts are still beating. The reflecting pool shows faces that don't match the visitors, and yesterday I saw myself holding hands with someone who cast no reflection. I'm Maria, and I work as caretaker for Serenity Gardens Memorial Park, maintaining the landscaping, monuments, and special features that provide comfort to grieving families. The park covers 42 acres of rolling hills and mature trees, with walking paths, meditation areas, and a reflecting pool that serves as the centerpiece for family gatherings and quiet contemplation. Mirror Lake is what families call the reflecting pool, a circular basin 12 feet in diameter, positioned behind the main mausoleum, where visitors can sit and remember their loved ones in peaceful surroundings. The water is kept clean and still, creating perfect reflections of the sky, surrounding trees, and anyone who approaches the edge to look down into the clear surface. But for the past 3 months, the reflections haven't been matching the people standing beside the pool. I first noticed the discrepancy during Mrs. Henderson's memorial gathering in October. Her family had chosen to scatter her ashes in the meditation garden, and several relatives gathered around Mirror Lake afterward for a moment of quiet reflection. When I checked the pool's condition from my position near the maintenance shed, something seemed wrong with the reflections. The family members standing around the pool appeared normal, but their reflections in the water showed them at different ages. Some appeared younger, others older, all seeming to represent different periods of their lives, rather than their current appearances. Mrs. Henderson's elderly son looked middle-aged in the reflection, while her teenage grandson appeared as a young child. I assumed it was an optical illusion created by water movement or lighting conditions. But when I approached for a closer look, the age discrepancies remained consistent. The water was perfectly still, the lighting was even, and there was no mechanical explanation for why the pool would show people as different ages than they actually were. Over the following weeks, I observed the pool during various family visits, documenting the reflection anomalies and trying to understand what was causing them. The pattern was consistent. Mirror Lake showed people as younger or older versions of themselves, but the age representation seemed meaningful rather than random. During grief counseling sessions, families would often mention how their reflections in the pool reminded them of happier times with their deceased relatives. They'd see themselves as they'd appeared during significant moments with their loved ones, younger versions who'd shared holidays, celebrations, or intimate family moments before death, created the absence they were mourning. The pool was showing people not as they currently appeared, but as they'd been during their most meaningful connections with the deceased. Grieving widows saw themselves as young brides. Elderly parents appeared as they'd looked when their children were small. Grandparents reflected as the vibrant adults their grandchildren had known before illness or age changed them. I started researching the history of Mirror Lake, looking for information about its construction and any unusual properties that might explain the reflection discrepancies. What I found was both beautiful and disturbing. The pool had been built over a natural spring that had been considered sacred by indigenous peoples who'd lived in the area before European settlement. According to historical accounts, the spring had been known as a place where the living could see visions of their ancestors, where water served as a window between the world of the present and the realm of memory and spirit. Early settlers had built their cemetery around the spring, recognizing its significance as a place where death and life maintained ongoing connection. Mirror Lake wasn't just reflecting current appearances, it was serving as a window into the timeless relationships that connect the living with the dead, showing people as they existed in the eternal moments of love and connection that death couldn't sever. But the reflections became more complex as winter approached. Instead of showing individual age variations, the pool began displaying additional figures, people standing beside the living visitors, holding hands or embracing them, but casting no reflections of their own in the water's surface. Mrs. Patterson discovered this phenomenon during her weekly visit to her husband's memorial bench. She was standing alone at the edge of Mirror Lake, grieving the first Christmas without her spouse of 57 years, when she noticed her reflection showed her holding hands with someone standing beside her. In the reflection, she appeared as a young woman in her 20s, dressed in the blue wedding dress she'd worn for her courthouse ceremony in 1966. Beside her reflection stood a young man in military uniform, her husband, as he'd appeared when they'd first met before his deployment to Vietnam. But Mrs. Patterson was standing alone beside the pool. There was no one next to her, no second set of footprints in the soft earth around the water's edge, no physical presence that could account for the additional figure in her reflection. Yet the reflected image clearly showed her holding hands with her deceased husband, both of them appearing as they had during their happiest years together. I began observing Mirror Lake more systematically, photographing reflections and comparing them to the actual people standing around the pool. The photographic evidence confirmed what I'd been witnessing. The pool consistently showed additional figures, deceased relatives, and friends standing beside grieving visitors, visible only in the water's reflection. The additional figures were always people the visitors had loved and lost, appearing at ages that represented their most meaningful relationships. Children who died young appeared as the adults they'd never become. Elderly relatives reflected as the vibrant people they'd been during family celebrations. Spouses showed themselves as they'd looked during romantic milestones or significant anniversaries. Last week, I experienced the phenomenon personally when I stopped by Mirror Lake during my lunch break. I'd been thinking about my mother, who died 5 years ago from cancer, remembering how she'd supported me during my divorce and career changes. When I looked into the pool, my reflection showed me as I'd appeared at age 35, the age I'd been when she'd helped me through the most difficult period of my life. Beside my reflection stood my mother as I remembered her best, healthy and strong, wearing the yellow sundress she'd loved during summer family gatherings. In the reflection, we were holding hands and smiling, sharing the kind of easy happiness that had characterized our relationship before illness changed everything. I reached out instinctively, trying to touch the hand that wasn't there, and felt a warmth on my palm that had nothing to do with the December air temperature. For just a moment, the reflection seemed to reach back, and I understood that Mirror Lake wasn't showing impossible images. It was revealing relationships that remained real despite death, connections that existed independently of physical presence. The reflecting pool shows faces that don't match the visitors because love creates its own reality, one that includes both the living and the dead, in timeless moments of connection and comfort. The additional figures don't cast reflections because they exist in the realm of memory and spirit, visible only through the sacred water that serves as a window between worlds. Mirror Lake has become more than a memorial feature. It's a place where grieving families can see evidence that their relationships with deceased loved ones continue, that death marks a transition rather than an ending, that love creates bonds strong enough to manifest in reflections even when physical presence is no longer possible. I maintain the pool carefully now, ensuring the water stays clean and still, providing the perfect surface for reflections that connect the living with the dead, through the eternal moments of love that death cannot diminish. The phones ring throughout the building after hours, and when I answer them, I hear the sound of people sleeping peacefully. I'm Pete, and I work night security for Eternal Rest Funeral Home, monitoring the building during evening and overnight hours when staff and families have gone home. It's quiet work that suits me, patrolling the facility, checking locks and systems, ensuring that our guests rest undisturbed until morning brings the business of memorial services and family visits. The building has 37 telephone extensions spread throughout offices, preparation rooms, and family consultation areas. During business hours, the phones provide communication between staff and coordination with families arranging services. After hours, all external calls route to an answering service, and internal extensions should remain silent except for security system alerts. But for the past 5 months, the phones have been ringing every night, always starting around 11 p.m. and continuing until dawn. The calls follow a predictable pattern. Different extensions ring at random intervals, sometimes the director's office, sometimes preparation room 3, sometimes the family consultation area or flower arrangement workspace. Each phone rings exactly 7 times before stopping, never connecting to voicemail or routing to external systems. When I first started hearing the nighttime calls, I assumed they were system malfunctions or external calls somehow bypassing the answering service. I'd answer the phones quickly, expecting to hear families with questions about services or vendors calling outside business hours. But when I picked up the ringing extensions, I never heard voices or conversation. Instead, I heard breathing, not distressed or labored breathing, but the slow, steady rhythm of deep sleep, peaceful inhalation and exhalation, sometimes accompanied by soft sounds, like someone shifting position or settling more comfortably. The breathing continued for several minutes before the line would disconnect, leaving me listening to dial tone and wondering who had called just to let me hear them sleep. The calls were consistent but unpredictable, different phones each night, varying times between rings. No pattern I could anticipate or prevent. I started documenting which extensions received calls and at what times, hoping to identify the source or purpose of the midnight communications. Over several weeks, I realized the calls were coming from internal extensions rather than external lines. The phone system's display showed internal numbers, extensions that corresponded to specific rooms within the funeral home. But those rooms were empty during night hours, containing no equipment or personnel that could initiate telephone call. I began investigating each extension that received midnight calls, checking the rooms for signs of activity, equipment malfunction, or anything that might explain how phones could ring from empty spaces. What I found was disturbing. The calls always came from rooms where we were storing bodies scheduled for services the next day. Preparation Room 3 received calls on nights when we were holding Mr. Davidson. The director's office phone rang during Mrs. Patterson's overnight stay. The family consultation area extension activated when we were storing multiple bodies before a busy service day. The pattern was clear. The calls originated from phones in rooms where the deceased were spending their final nights above ground. I started answering the calls more quickly, listening carefully to the peaceful breathing, and trying to understand what the deceased might be communicating through their midnight telephone use. The breathing was always calm and content, suggesting people who were resting comfortably rather than experiencing distress or disturbance. Sometimes I could hear background sounds that provided context for the peaceful breathing. Soft music, like hymns or lullabies playing at low volume. Gentle conversation, too quiet to distinguish words, but warm and reassuring in tone. Occasionally, what sounded like family gatherings, multiple voices sharing stories, laughing softly, creating the kind of comfortable noise that accompanies celebrations or reunions. I realized the deceased weren't calling to communicate with the living, they were calling each other, using the funeral home's telephone system to maintain contact during their final nights before burial. The breathing I heard was evidence of peaceful rest, shared among people who'd found community in death, comfort in the knowledge that they weren't waiting alone for their final services. I tested this theory by staying late one evening when we were storing Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who died peacefully at home surrounded by family. When her extension rang at 11:15 p.m., I answered immediately and listened carefully to what was happening on the other end. The breathing was peaceful as always, but this time I could hear voices in the background, soft conversation that sounded like family members, sharing memories, telling stories, offering comfort during the transition between life and whatever comes next. Mrs. Chen's breathing suggested someone resting contentedly while surrounded by loved ones, not alone in a sterile preparation room, but part of a gathering that included both the recently deceased and those who'd gone before. When I spoke softly into the phone, "Rest well, Mrs. Chen," the breathing paused for a moment, as if she'd heard and acknowledged my good night wishes. Then it resumed its peaceful rhythm until the call disconnected several minutes later. I started answering all the midnight calls with gentle greetings, treating them as opportunities to offer comfort rather than mysterious disturbances to investigate. "Sleep peacefully," I'd say, or "rest well until morning." The breathing would often pause when I spoke, suggesting awareness and appreciation for the living person who was acknowledging their final night above ground. The calls became a comfort rather than a mystery. Instead of viewing them as equipment malfunctions or supernatural disruptions, I understood them as evidence that death includes its own forms of communication and community. The deceased were using available technology to maintain connection with each other, creating networks of support that helped them transition peacefully from life to whatever follows burial. Last month, during a particularly busy week with multiple services scheduled, I received calls from 6 different extensions in a single night. Each phone rang with its familiar 7-ring pattern, and each call brought the sound of peaceful breathing, accompanied by background conversation and soft music. But this time, the calls seemed coordinated. A conference call network connecting people who'd found each other in death. When I answered the first call from Preparation Room 2, I heard multiple voices breathing in harmony, creating a sound like a sleeping choir. The second call from the director's office brought similar harmonized breathing, but with additional voices that suggested the group was growing larger. By the 6th call, from the family consultation area, I was listening to what sounded like dozens of people breathing together in perfect, peaceful rhythm. I realized the deceased weren't just calling each other individually, they were creating community gatherings, bringing together everyone who was spending their final nights in funeral homes throughout the area. The telephone system had become their social network, allowing them to share the transition experience rather than facing it in isolation. I started researching the telephone system's technical capabilities, wondering if there were features that might explain how internal extensions could connect to external funeral homes or create conference calls without operator intervention. What I discovered was more remarkable than technical glitches or equipment malfunctions. Our telephone system had been installed in 1987 by Morrison Electronics, a family business owned by Robert Morrison, whose father had been a funeral director before starting the communications company. Robert had designed the system specifically for funeral homes, understanding that these buildings needed communications infrastructure that could handle both business operations and the unique emotional needs of grieving families. According to the installation documentation, Robert had included features that weren't standard in commercial telephone systems, conference calling capabilities that could connect multiple locations, background music integration for peaceful environments, and internal routing that prioritized comfort and dignity over efficiency. He designed the system to serve funeral homes as more than just business operations, but as places where the transition between life and death required special attention to communication and community. The midnight calls weren't equipment malfunctions, they were features, designed to allow the deceased to maintain connection and support during their final hours above ground. Robert Morrison had understood that death is a social experience, that people need community during transitions, and that telephone technology could serve purposes deeper than business communication. I stopped documenting the calls as security incidents and started treating them as an expected part of night operations. When phones ring after 11 p.m., I answer them with respect and warmth, acknowledging that the deceased are using the building's communication systems to create the community they need during their final nights. The calls continue every night, connecting people who've found each other in death, providing the social support that makes the transition from life to burial less frightening and more peaceful. I've become the living witness to their gatherings, the night security officer who ensures their communications aren't interrupted by technical problems or misunderstanding about the true purpose of our telephone system. The phones ring throughout the building after hours because death doesn't end the human need for connection, and good communication systems serve purposes their designers never anticipated. The deceased make their calls, share their peaceful breathing, and create community that transcends the boundaries between funeral homes, between individual deaths, between the fear of isolation, and the comfort of knowing others are making the same journey. When I answer the midnight calls now, I hear the sound of people sleeping peacefully together, no longer alone in their final hours above ground, connected by telephone technology that serves as a bridge between the living and the dead, ensuring that everyone who passes through our building finds the community they need during their most vulnerable transition. Last call comes every night around dawn, when the community gathering disperses and individual extensions fall silent, until the next evening brings new voices to the network. It's a comfort to know that death includes its own forms of communication, that technology can serve purposes deeper than its original design, and that no one has to face their final night above ground without the sound of others breathing peacefully nearby.